Pokemon sizes. The Pokedex gives you a number. That's what size the Pokemon is. Seems simple and straightforward, right? No. No, it is anything but simple. Let's take it from the top. If a Pokemon stands up on 2 legs, then you measure it like you would measure a person from the ground to the top of their head. Great. If a Pokemon is more like a serpent, so we've got our snakes, we've got eels, then you measure it just from tip of the nose to tip of the tail. Cool. If a Pokemon stands on 4 legs, then you measure it similarly from the ground to the top of the head on its 4 legs the way it would naturally stand. Unless it will later stand up, in which case then you do measure it from the tip of its face to those hind legs as if it stood up on them, but you don't count the tail because the tail doesn't count. Unless the Pokemon is basically just a noodle, and then you do measure it more like a serpent. Even though it has 4 legs and it stands on those 4 legs, you still measure it from its face to the tip of its tail because now tails do count. Some Pokemon just float and don't actually stand at all. Ears don't count towards height, except for the times when they do, but hair tufts on the top of their heads do count towards height, except for when they don't. Objects that Pokemon hold or always have carried around with them don't count towards their height because they're not actually part of the Pokemon. Unless they're a ghost type, in which case presumably they're possessing that object, so it does count as part of their body, and then we do count it towards height. Except still not always, sometimes we still don't, even if it's a ghost. And if you think that any of the tools that we have at our disposal to compare and contrast and reference Pokemon sizes against each other are going to help you in this endeavor to understand Pokemon sizes, you are mistaken. Okay, let's back it up. So if you have played any Pokemon games, you are familiar with the Pokedex. The Pokedex is a magical device gifted to you by the professor of that region when you start your Pokemon journey. This is a device that will automatically fill in information about any Pokemon upon catching that Pokemon. There are some different theories and headcanons that the trainers, the children receiving Pokedexes, given the request to help the professor by filling it in, are actually the ones handwriting the information we see in the Pokedex. I think this is a misconception, personally. Some people use the children made this up type of theory to claim that the Pokedex is just inherently incorrect or flawed or unreliable, but for the purpose of all of my research, I choose to have faith in the Pokemon researchers that this is accurate information. Regardless of how that information got in the Pokedex, once you start actually trying to use it as a resource, as a reference to try and figure out the precise sizes of different Pokemon, you'll realize it's pretty meaningless anyways, because it provides information in exactly one way. Across the different Pokedex from the different region, there has been some variance in exactly what information is there. Sometimes it includes things like footprints and cries and habitat, but there are 2 pieces of information that you can always count on getting from a Pokedex in every Pokemon game, and that is length and weight. Yes, it tends to be pretty straightforward for Pokemon that stand on 2 feet or have a vaguely humanoid body type, but what about a Pokemon that looks like this? Just how would you measure a Metang? What dimension do you suppose length refers to on a Pokemon like this? What about a Pokemon like Geodude? How would you expect to measure a Geodude? What do you suppose length means for that one? And despite having very similar body shapes, what if I told you they are not measured the same? So basically, there is a lot more to unpack than I think most people realize when you really want to get into the specific details of how Pokemon are actually measured. And the unfortunate answer is that this is not something that's always consistent, even between games and the anime. It's a tricky one to figure out. But there are some general rules and guidelines that I have figured out that can give you a pretty good guess most of the time. We'll start off by grouping Pokemon into a few broad categories, and then we'll apply some different exceptions and kind of rules on top of that. So first up, we've got our bipeds. Bipeds I basically count as anything that stands on 2 feet, it stands upright, and when this is the case, that makes it very simple. You measure them from the ground to the top of them. Ideally, it's the top of their head, And as far as measuring Pokemon, this is about as simple and predictable as it gets. There's not a lot of curveballs or ways to trip you up. They are upright Pokemon you measure from the ground up. Next, we have some Pokemon that I lovingly refer to as tubes. So pretty much what it describes, anything that's basically just a long skinny tube. So this is going to include a lot of different species. We're talking about our snakes, our eels, our caterpillars. Occasionally it's a mammal. But again, pretty straightforward because they have one kind of dominant dimension. Very predictable. You measure them height as a length. Then we have our fish. They are, for the most part, functionally the same as tubes. They don't have that same shape, but the similar idea that they have a dominant dimension. So they are also typically measured as a length from one end to another. There are occasional exceptions for fish that aren't exactly traditionally fish-shaped, but as we're talking about general rules, that's how we deal with fish. Then we've got the winged Pokemon. So the thing about these Pokemon, some of them can put their wings away. Some of them cannot put their wings away. Does this impact how we measure them? Not really. We tend to treat them kind of like a biped. Most Pokemon, at least if you watch the anime, you will see them land at some point, in which case they effectively become a biped. But regardless, we tend to ignore their wings and their wingspan, and these things don't seem to factor into their size. We mostly just look at their body and measure their body as their height. Now we've got some blobs. Blobs are an interesting one where it's hard to exactly classify what shape you're looking at. And so for these Pokemon, the general rule that I'll go by is measuring their largest dimension, whichever that should be. Now this often does work out to still be similar to the bipeds and the wings. Like it's usually an up and down height type of measurement, but sometimes it's like a sphere. Spheres I count as a blob, and they are the best because they only have one dimension. Every single size you could measure is the same, unless you went circumference, but that would be weird. And finally, we have our tricksters, some of the most fun to discuss. These are Pokemon who are not quite what they appear. Their size is somehow deceptive. So typically, this is because they include some form of inanimate object in their design. It is an integral part of their design. You never see them without it, and yet it is not part of them. So the size we see in the Pokedex only refers to the Pokemon itself, not including their object, but it's not always apparent at first glance what is and isn't part of that Pokemon. Then we get to our main category that I would say, dare I say, the majority of Pokemon fall into somehow, because quadrupeds span a massive number of species. So when we start to get into all of the quadrupeds is when we start to get into a lot more of those exceptions that I was pointing out at the very beginning of the video. Because there is such a vast kind of range of Pokemon that can be considered quadrupeds, we have to start relying more on what I consider to be kind of the golden rule, I guess, of ambiguous Pokedex entries. What is the most descriptive way to measure this Pokemon? So we're looking for something that is the most useful in terms of visualizing the Pokemon if all you're told is its size. And this is often something that can be very context dependent. There's a lot of different context clues that we can look at to try and make that final decision on how to interpret it. So yes, that sort of base rule for all quadrupeds is going to be similar to the bipeds. As a rule, we will measure a lot of them just from the ground to the top of their head in their natural standing position. Now, if we pull up the picture of Sandile again, on its own, measuring it from the ground to the top of its head could make sense, but sometimes looking at context clues will mean looking to the evolutions for more information. Crocodile and Krokorok both stand up on 2 feet, and so for continuity of the evolution line, it kind of makes sense to measure Sandile as if it did as well, because all 3 of them across this evolution line do have the same body type. They are all generally crocodile shaped. So to get the most relevant information from the Pokedex, as a trainer to understand the difference in size from one evolution to the next, it's helpful for our understanding for it all to be measured consistently. And working backwards in this way can be a really good way to help make deductions when it is an ambiguous Pokemon. So if we were looking at Sandile and truly found it unclear whether that would be 1'4" ground to top of the head or 1'4" length, then we can take a look at the evolutions for clues, because if we see the height of a Krokorok, then if you look at Sandile, if you were to assume that the 1'4" measurement for Sandile did refer to ground to top of the head as it stands on its natural 4-foot posture, then that would make Sandile itself bigger than Krokorok. So that's one way you can piece that together, that if it seems like measuring it a certain way would lead to a kind of continuity problem within the line, then you probably have your answer. And this is the same kind of logic that I used to decipher the Jumpluff line, because let me tell you, that one took me a moment. Let's take a look at Hoppip. So based on this design, I would say this is one of our ambiguous Pokemon. Do the leaves on its head count towards its overall height? Do they not? Well, in this case, the best thing I could think to do was to look to its evolutions, look for those context clues. So if you take a look at Skiploom, we'll see that Skiploom doesn't have tall leaves like that. It just has a flower, and the flower is very flat, very close to its head, doesn't add a lot of height if you were to count it. So, knowing that Hoppip is a 40 centimeter Pokemon, Skiploom being a 60 centimeter Pokemon, this means that the difference between their size is significantly impacted by whether or not we count those flowers and leaves on top of their heads. And so similar to what we were discussing with Sandile's evolution line, often what we're comparing with relative sizes of different Pokemon is the body type that is shared between them, the form that we can look at comparatively between the Pokemon when applicable. So if we're looking at a Hoppip and a Skiploom, and we see that they both have a very similar sort of round body with something on their head, it would start to make some sense that what we're comparing is that core body. And then looking one step farther, we look to Jumpluff, and we see Jumpluff is an 80 centimeter Pokemon. Now, the thing is, if the body were 80 centimeters itself, just Jumpluff's body, that is a very large sphere to be just its body. And so all of a sudden, Jumpluff becomes this massive trainer-sized Pokemon over 5 feet tall. And while this isn't impossible for a Pokemon, there are lots of very large Pokemon, it does feel a little bit jarring. And again, we're hitting that zone of it feels unintuitive. It seems like a big jump from one Pokemon to the next. Unfortunately, as it turns out, this is something that we can cross-check with the right tools. If you take something like Pokemon Home that allows you to compare the silhouettes theoretically to scale of every Pokemon, you'll see that the silhouette of Hoppip and Jumpluff are actually basically the same size. And I think in a sense this does still make a lot of sense, because Hoppip's leaves are fairly fixed in place, but they're coming out the top of its head. They don't seem to be entirely structural, they move around, whereas Jumpluff's puffs are very core elements of its design. They seem very critical and crucial to the design overall. They seem very fixed in place. And this is a good lead-in to our general discussion on these auxiliary features of Pokemon. Hair tufts and horns and ears, when do we count them and when don't we? Now, I'm going to be transparent on this one. I don't know for every Pokemon. I don't have every answer, but I have done a lot of research, and there are a lot of exceptions, there are a lot of outliers, there are certain Pokemon that I have reason to believe are measured in a way that I never would have actually guessed. I'm going to be making an entire video on the evolutions at this point. That one has been perplexing. The rules that I have found to hold true overall is that the more fixed a feature is on the Pokemon, and the more central to its overall design, the more likely we are to count it towards height. So taking a look at Tandemaus, this was an example I gave for a Pokemon where we will count its ears in the height. The ears do not move. They're a very central part of the design. They take up a lot of the overall space in the design. And if you compare that to another Pokemon like Pikachu, well, Pikachu's ears right off the bat are a little bit more slight. They're not as predominant of a feature. And they also move frequently. Pikachu uses his ears to emote, to express all the time. And so it wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense to count something towards the height of a Pokemon if it can just move it. If it moves its ears down, Does that mean that now you have to change Pikachu's height? So it's easier to just measure up to a point that you know is going to be a fixed place. Okay, so with everything that we have discussed here today, let's go back to Geodude and Metang. Now, Geodude I actually consider to be one of the more intuitive Pokemon. His arms move around a lot, just like Pikachu's ears, and just like a person, you can't make yourself taller by reaching an arm above your head. So I don't think many people would expect it to make sense to measure Geodude's arms as part of its height. So all that really leaves us with is the main body, which is approximately a sphere, which is the easiest of the Pokemon to measure. And that is in fact how we measure Geodude. Metang, despite being the same shape as Geodude, gets a little more complicated. The fact that Metang is 3'11" is far too big to be used the same way we measured Geodude. That would make a pretty monstrous and ridiculous Pokemon. But what does that leave us with? Do we measure it from side to side? Well, let's look at the evolutions for context. So what's fun about the Metagross line is that they seem to build together, almost like a magneton, by bringing together individual Beldum and kind of stacking them up into a new Pokemon. In fact, the creator, Mr. Omnisphere, actually has a really cool animation showing this. But if you take a look at Beldum, it is one of those Pokemon that only has one obvious dimension to measure, so we can feel confident about the size of a Beldum. When you look at Metang's arms, in this situation, in this exception, the arms are Beldums, and that does make it seem like a much more core element of the Pokemon to have it worked in that regard. Then you look forward to Metagross, and you can see that Metagross no longer floats. There's no longer any hovering, which right away makes it much easier to measure because you have, measuring from the ground as an option. And we can see that it has the same type of design. Its legs still seem to be built out of Beldums, and now those legs that we kind of were considering arms on Metang, very clearly legs on Metagross, and very clearly contribute to its height. Metang is a floating Pokemon, but knowing that it eventually will stand on 4 legs, and that its body shape, its overall anatomy, is still comparable to its evolution, this is a situation where it makes most sense to treat those arms kind of like legs, treat the bottom of where they hang like the ground, essentially, as though it were standing on them, and measure all the way from the bottom of his arms to the top of his head. Unconventional in isolation, but the most sense inside of the context. Now, I said earlier that none of the tools out there to help you visualize the Pokedex are really going to help you. I exaggerate. They are very helpful tools. There is no one tool that I have found that I consider like gold standard for Pokemon sizing. There is nothing that I will take as the hard and fast truth of the matter from any different source. And this is where things get a little bit messy when you're trying to get as specific as I do about the size of Pokemon, because I think at some point you have to understand that there just isn't consistency across every single source of Pokemon media. There's so much Pokemon out there. Some of them are inside different canons, different timelines, and honestly just different art directors handling them can be a big impact. But there are a lot of tools that we can use to help get an idea. I have spent a lot of time live at this point on Pokemon Violet and Pokemon Legends Arceus. I've started playing a little bit of Pokemon Shield and Pokemon Snap even. There's a lot of games that we have now that show these Pokemon in 3D space interacting with each other, interacting with their trainers. And that's a really good guideline because they are all scaled in theory. And there you have it. We have now covered all of the bases, learning the very basics of interpreting the Pokedex. Certainly, there are still plenty of exceptions, as I continue to say, and things that will surprise you, even using these guidelines as your basis. I never would have actually guessed how Gimmighoul chest form was measured. It looks to me like it's about 1 foot to the top of Gimmighoul's head. Is that not the least expected way
to possibly measure this? It's the same height as Grookey. Oh my gosh. That's so silly.
That caught me by surprise. Now, if you enjoyed indulging me in my deep analysis, I recommend subscribing to the channel. I will be making follow-up videos in this series, focusing in on some of the individual Pokemon that I find to be the most interesting or perplexing in terms of how the Pokemon Company decided to measure their size. And yes, the evolutions do seem to be a bit of a doozy, so that should be a good video. I do have more research to do on that, and I actually will be doing some of that research live on this channel. I've got a playlist for VODs of all of the live streams I've already done doing some research in the past, and just other size analysis videos. Anywho, I hope we all had a good time here today. I hope to see you again here soon, and good work today, trainers.